Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. It's that time of year where we talk about the year in review. Jim, what was the most important thing that happened this last year as far as what we've covered?
Actually, the most important thing that happened last year was the things that didn't happen. There's been less terrorism. I mean, it's been a decline since 2014. In fact, terrorism deaths are down over 50%. Since 2014. Last year, I think they went from 34,000 in 2014 to about 17,000 last year, and they've continued to decline this year. I think Pakistan went under 1,000 terrorism deaths a year inside Pakistan for the first time in, I'd have to check, it's been a long time, over a decade. India is having a little more because Pakistan is, but that's another story. But they're still way under, Pakistan, especially per capita. So it's down pretty much everywhere, and even Iraq, of all places. ISIL is making a comeback there, as it were, trying to. But I think that's one reason why the United States is building a third base on the Iraqi. This was revealed, as it were, around the 9th of early December, before it was announced that we were pulling the troops out of Syria. And apparently some of them are going to that new base, and actually to the other bases. We have, I think, 3 now in Anbar, and another one up in Kurdistan, Kurdland, whatever you want to call it. So even Syria is showing signs of hope. Of course, the big problem in Syria is you got a melange of allies aiding the Syrian government, and these allies don't like each other very much. But that's another story. Africa, as Austin is covering the last 2 updates on that for this year, but there is sort of peace in South Sudan. It's holding, as it were. There will be elections in Congo, although they've been delayed in several major cities in the northeast. About 3% of the population will have to wait until I think February to vote. Of course, the new president will be elected. How should I put it? Will be decided by then. If he isn't, then those 2 areas will become critical. But Austin can explain that. He's been covering that. That's another story. The Afghanistan is still a mess. It's always a mess. In the East Asia, peace is breaking out everywhere. I mean, it's looking to be a pretty good new year. The Philippines, Venezuela is still falling apart. I mean, the people are literally starving. But I mean, there's as yet, and in fact, I doubt if there will be any civil war, because I mean, people would rather get out than fight. I mean, that's what it comes down to. In the Americas, there's not much else going on. In Europe, terrorism deaths are down again. Let me see. That takes care of just about everybody. I mean, basically, it's been getting more peaceful. There's still, tension between Russia and NATO, as it were, but that is going down for the simple reason that Russia is losing, as they usually do when they start a war with somebody they don't have to start a war with, or not an undeclared war at that, a new Cold War. Putin has bet for the first time this year. He's been losing the how should I put the popularity polls inside Russia, and I think we reported this in the recent Russia update, and the percentage of Russians blaming him personally for all the problems they've been having, personal problems, has gone over 50%. So that's an interesting development. China, Big Brother is still coming. China has become a little less aggressive Again, I get because they have more problems at home. Korea is still Korea. Iran is still Iran. But both those countries are not doing well internally, not well at all. But peace is breaking out in the Korean Peninsula as well, slowly, unpredictably, as it were. And then, of course, American troops getting pulled out of Syria, and some of them, a lot of them, about half of them are coming out of Afghanistan. Again, I think the new strategy is let our allies get involved. I think the Afghanistan strategy. I'm guessing, and we don't like to speculate like that, but it apparently a lot of the countries that have been trying to look the other way cannot. With the drugs, the heroin coming in from Afghanistan, and the UN finally recognizing that Pakistan is the major, supporter and instigator of Islamic terrorism in that part of the world. The pressure is going to be on the military. Actually, I mean, Pakistan is basically an army with a country attached, as they used to say about Prussia back in the day before the Prussian Empire came apart. And Afghanistan is the one that's suffering, and the Afghans are basically, they're aware of it. They admit it. They're in Pakistan, the Pashtuns, who there's twice as many Pashtuns as there are in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, as there are in Afghanistan. In other words, 2/3 of the Pashtuns are in Pakistan, where they're a minority, but they're the biggest minority in Afghanistan, and they control the Taliban and the drug trade. They are the biggest problem. But in Pakistan, they realize that they're being plagued by their own government. Well, surprise, surprise. I mean, that's been whispered about for a long time, but now Pashtuns are actually demonstrating. They're out in the streets, and they're basically complaining about the army, stirring up and supporting all this terrorism, and basically letting the Pashtuns do most of the suffering, which is what's happening now. So that's a welcome change. As they say, the first step in recovery is recognize you have a problem, and you're getting that self-awareness in places like Afghanistan. There's also more, of course, unrest in Pakistan, mainly against the censorship that the military is now imposing. Even the courts in Pakistan are now cracking down on the military, which is unheard of. Recently we thought the courts were basically going to kowtow to the military, but they're fighting back, and that's a welcome change. Although it's dangerous for people with no guns to go after all those people with guns, but that's a Pakistani problem, which at least the world is starting to recognize. So all in all, there's a lot of good news. Happy New Year.
Austin, what did you see as the biggest?
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, what did you see as the biggest story this last year?
Well, I tell you, there are two, and they're tightly related. The biggest is the slight yet significant diplomatic political change in the Korean War. Trump administration's coercive diplomatic effort really running from February 2017 through June 2018. But a lot of the significant action was in obviously the first 6 months of this year. It changed something. Everyone is aware that suddenly an opportunity has appeared to change the military and political gridlock, a very threatening one, on the Korean Peninsula. And yes, the big word is still complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. And the Kim gang regime, they are a gang, they're gangsters. Boy, they don't want to do that. But they're also confronting their own There's some economic opportunity for them, the opportunities to survive. The downside is their destruction. And I believe one of the elements, and when the history's written on this, is that they were convinced that the Trump administration was going to destroy them if they wedded a nuclear warhead to an ICBM that was capable of hitting Seattle and Los Angeles. That's kind of the bottom line on that. That's Austin Bay's speculation. But that coercive diplomatic effort the Trump administration executed, and it's still continuing, managed to reach the reptilian brain cells of Kim Jong-un. I also think he's a greedy character, and Trump was telling them that they built condos in North Korea, and he had a great future, kid, as long as you denuclearize. That's huge, Dan. Jim served in South Korea when he was on active duty. I've been there
years ago.
I know, man. But look, and the reason I brought that up, Jim, is that there was a lot that hadn't changed until this last year. This is the first time since June of 1950 that you had a chance to actually move from I call it a gridlock military situation, a frozen war. And that's huge. Now, what I said was related to it is the United States is also using its economic weaponry in a way that, America did it with, the Marshall Plan was an example of it. We've certainly had it through the Cold War. We could immensely successful economy and the Soviets couldn't keep up with it. But more selective use for in many North Korea is an example of it. Russia is an example of it, and I'm not just talking about sanctions. I'm talking about economic penalties exacted on senior officials and the oligarchs. That's the legal component of it, but also the so-called trade war. Trade war's got China's attention. I'm a little less optimistic about China. For instance, just this week, they've installed new radars and surveillance equipment, and likely new weapons in the Paracel Islands on one of their big installations in the Paracels. And one of their senior officials in their maritime commercial shipping, believe me, though, that's still militarized, said that that really what we're looking at is a confrontation between Chinese sovereignty and China's historic rights and the U.S. demand of freedom of navigation. And he says, there's no either, there's no both. China has sovereignty over that area, and the U.S. demands for freedom of navigation. That's just an affront to us. I read it. There was an article in one of the Australian newspapers just this week, quoting this fellow's speech. But it's right in line with what you get from the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing vis-a-vis the South China Sea. Similar language is used when things heat up in the Himalayas. I know it doesn't. That sounds like a mixed metaphor, doesn't it, Dana? Heating up in the Himalayas, but it does between India and China. These need to be both of these need to be watched because they're great powers, China and the United States, colliding in the South China Sea, and India is a major regional power with reach. It doesn't have China's global reach. China certainly doesn't have the global reach the U.S. does, but they're still building a high-tech military. Now, Jim is quite aware of the weaknesses and we cover that in depth, and we cover it well, the weaknesses in China's arms buildup. But they're building a lot of stuff. Maybe they won't use it, but their neighbors, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea. There was a Chinese violation of South Korean airspace just this week, too. A military jet slips in, slips out. They're playing games with their neighbors, and they're ticking their neighbors off. We've talked about this on Strategy Talk. These are bad signs. I'm not pessimistic, but there's reasons to sit back and soberly confront what China is doing. I think those. I'll add something else. Jim's covered the terror aspect. He wanted me to say something about Congo. These stuttering elections, because they were supposed to happen on Sunday, December the 23rd. There's real signs of fraud. About probably over half of the country is sick and tired of the Kabilas, and yet Kabila's preferred candidate, it's very likely he's going to win the presidency, probably crookedly. Will that ignite a new Great Congo War? That's something we've speculated about. I've written about it. Oddly enough, there are a lot of people tired of all the fighting. But the fact is it could. And the last one, we've talked about how many people died between 1996 and 2003. Some people call them two different Congolese wars. The fighting never stopped. And to some degree, it still hasn't. But it's 3 to 5 million people. That was a humanitarian disaster. Now, I don't think conditions are where they were. I know they're not in 2003, certainly not 1996. But the possibility of a conflagration cannot be dismissed. I don't put that in the same league, of course, with China versus the United States, or again the significant change on the Korean Peninsula. I'll say one other thing, and this is something of a sidebar. Mexico's cartel war is it's still going on. It doesn't seem to be as pervasive as it has in the past, but there's still murders. There's and kidnappings. What's interesting to me is the new president, AMLO, Lopez Obrador, has, for about 40 years, Dan, he has been the loud man of Mexico's left, a socialist, nationalize everything because of the oligarchs, because of the Yankees and whatever. He had the standard list of demons, and now he's president. And one of the things he was claiming he was going to do was renationalize Mexico's oil business. Well, he seems to have backed off on that. He's also agreed to the renegotiated NAFTA that the prior president agreed to just this fall. Why? Part of it is he understands America's, the U.S.'s, economic might. And the way that New Deal was structured, it gives Mexico a lot of preferred opportunities for trade and manufacturing at the expense of China. That's the way the Mexicans Mexicans see it. And that's another dimension of what I said about the United States using its the E and dime economic power for diminish China's economy, penalize it for not just its illegal or quasi-legal trade policies, but also slow down that economic engine that is powering the Chinese military building. These things take a while to work. None of them are decisive. But that is an example of the United States, I think, using its economy to achieve a strategic end in a military competition with another great power. Small. But it's interesting, and it happened this year, Dan.
Jim, we cover a lot of things that the mainstream media doesn't cover, but what's one of the things that we covered that the mainstream media didn't, that you think had the biggest impact on last year?
Well, I think it's the overall decline in terrorism. The media, makes money by featuring, it's more terrorism. There's there's more danger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there isn't. The media also, media it's two different media we got to consider. The media in the United States is sort of going through a crisis for the last 2 years. They're obsessed with local national, American politics, and that basically colors everything they do. I mean, I use media sources, and one thing I've noticed in the last 2 years is that you sometimes get reliably completely different stories from, say, the British or the German or the French media than you do from most of the American mainstream media. So that's a story, of course, they haven't covered. Although it's getting more attention in Europe. Especially since you had this recent scandal where the Spiegel, how should I put it, the German news magazine, they're doing better than Time and Newsweek and the U.S. News, the previous big three in the United States are. But they did it basically by pandering to what they thought were the baser instincts. In other words, bashing, the President Trump, Donald Trump, and that, in a how should I put it, in a sweet irony, that bit them in the butt, because one of their star reporters, who had received awards from American and European, sources, turned out to be a fraud, and most of his fraud had to do with, guess what? So that they, to their credit, they basically gave it front page, attention, and it's being covered, diligently. But this guy is not the only one, and that's got the European media, getting their own house in order and not looking to what's going on in the United States, which is apparently more, illusion than fact. So that's good news, which unfortunately, yes, very much so, is not being covered by the American press. And that is a big story. Also, you get that slant in the American press, which basically takes the party line of the Democratic Party, and it basically colors everything. I mean, for example, it's sort of a joke. You look at the reporting on Venezuela, and it's always explained as, well, bad luck, incompetent government. They never mention that this is all about socialism. That's sort of a hot topic you're not supposed to touch. You got the same thing going on in Britain, where they have a Labour Party which has gone full socialist, and nobody wants to point out, well, why do they sort of fall short when they come close to counting heads? Of course, the reason is simple. The average person can do the basic math involved there. That's how the post-World War II British socialists lost power. They had it for almost 10 years, and then Churchill was invited back. Please, Mr. Churchill, save us from ourselves. And then eventually they had to get Thatcher back to undo all the nationalization and economic chaos. that the pie in the sky crowd had basically promulgated. But that's always with us. I mean, that's ancient history. The fall of Rome is probably the best example. They had a republic for 500 years, and eventually it came apart because of economic issues, government mismanagement, corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an old story. I mean, that's something else that rarely gets covered. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the American Republic, he pointed out we need a revolution every 20 years. And it took me a while to figure out what he meant. I dug into that a little deeper. He wasn't talking about violent revolution, but you got to clean up the government. And of course, we missed a number of 20-year cycles. But you'll notice that the people, even economists notice that every time there's a boom in the American economy, it tends to be about the same time they cleaned the stables, as it were, knocked a lot of the horse crap out. But it creeps right back in. I mean, it's just human nature. And that's something else the media doesn't like to cover because in large doses it endangers, their business model because they do. I learned that when I was in the magazine business. There's sort of an understanding you're supposed to go along with all sorts of shady practices. And I said, what? And I got schooled. I mean, I knew people in the media, even the Wall Street Journal, and they said, yeah, this is the way it goes. I mean, the Journal was always pretty straight, and they were called all sorts of names for that. But that's where it goes. And you can see it, we're hitting peak journalistic corruption in the United States. And of course, that is not a story. We don't really cover it either, not head on. I mean, you just read our coverage and say, well, what are they talking about? That's not what I'm reading, in the big, local newspaper or the mainstream TV news reports. But if you go to Europe, and we pointed that out, if you want to get a different view of what's going on in your own backyard, check the coverage overseas. It's easy in Britain. It's a little more difficult in non-English speaking countries, although most of them have English versions of their headline news, as it were. But you'll see it even there. I mean, especially since they have more of the English translations. I think they're finding they're gaining a larger market in the United States for people. It's like Radio Free America is now not coming from America. It's coming from other countries. But it's always a trip. I mean, we've pointed this out numerous times in Strategy Page over the years. You get a very interesting, different perspective. Just reading from other countries. You want to get a really different perspective on what's going on in North Korea, read the South Korean media. I was over there 50 years ago. Go ahead.
Jim, I do every day. I read Jan Han.
I know.
Every day. And it's just, you do get, I'm chuckling about it, but what you're saying is so on target.
Yes, and many of our readers do, but and we still have a lot of journalists reading Strategy Page, often on the down low because it's not politically correct in some areas. But we were surprised when we found out that the largest chunk of our readership were foreign business people. Business people, who had an economic interest in what the heck was going on in the West and the United States and what have you, and that's probably gone up. We haven't run those surveys recently, but I've asked them, and we've heard from some feedback from some of those users, and I asked them, and they all say the same thing. So, we get even-handed. We may not agree with it, but at least we know it's not being, read from some political playbook.
Let me give an example of this. This story has shown up in a few places in the U.S., but South Korea and North Korea in the various meetings that mostly is President Moon who's doing this, and I see it as tied to the overall. It's aligned with what the Trump administration is doing. But here's an example. They agreed, North Korea agreed to let South Korea's, essentially its railroad administration, get some of their mechanical engineers and construction engineers. And a South Korean train engine was allowed to go on both the West Coast route all the way up to the Chinese border. That did that earlier this year, but just recently did the East Coast coming up into that mountain range that's up in the tri-border area of Russia, China, and North Korea. And Jan Hopp's coverage of it was far more detailed. And here's what one of the South Korean, again, construction engineers and mechanical engineers reported, is that, all right, we knew this, how bad it was, but they said that the engine, for many stretches, couldn't go over 20 kilometers an hour. In other words, 12 miles an hour, because the rail bed was so bad. North Korea let South Korea take data as to where the problems were. Okay, virtually the entire route. Now, why is this going on? What's going on? Because South Korea has said, yes, we're interested in helping you modernize your railroads, and we'll need the data because we're going to have to figure out how much that's going to cost. But it's not going to happen unless you get rid of your nuclear weapons. And see, this is one of the indicators in there that the North, as nuts as the Kim regime is and can be, it's also as violent as that regime is. It's also seen a tiny little bit of light saying, wait a minute, if we cooperate now, why, maybe we will be able to improve our lives here and stay alive. It's the time has come to cash in the nukes. All right. I've moved it forward. I don't know that that's going to happen. But Jan Hopp covers all of these. This isn't the only one. I've gone into some detail about it because it deals with infrastructure. It also is the South Korean Railroad Ministry was conducting an intelligence operation, Dan, a very detailed intelligence gathering operation about North Korean railroads. And that is a step towards where we talk about verification of intensive, sustained verification of North Korean disarmament. One of the big concerns, and still one of my huge concerns, is how is North Korea going to react when they see what we mean we're going to do, when we're going to verify that you guys are getting rid of your special weapons? South Korea, it's not that we couldn't send drones and do it, but South Korea now has detailed, literally on the rail bed, information about North Korea's two major rail lines on both sides of the peninsula. I think earlier they had already done the rail line that runs kind of from the Kaesong area up to Pyongyang, if I recall reading that. So they've done the central one, and Kaesong is that special economic area in North Korea that during the Sunshine Policy South Korea financed. So they checked that line out as well. This is a tentative form of verification, and North Korea's not only permitting it, they're permitting it. They're asking for it. Now, that's another indication to me when I said that something's changed. Hadn't changed. We haven't achieved what the United States hasn't achieved what it wants to achieve, and South Korea wants them to get rid of the nukes too. But here's this process. Do you see this covered in depth in mainstream media?
No.
Really, you don't. You don't. And I went into just providing a detail to support what Jim was saying. By the way, that Spiegel reporter that Jim was talking about, the German magazine, he made up an entire article about, I think the town was in Minnesota, and it was just a complete fraud. There were two. It took a little doing, but there were two people in the town. That's it. There were two people in that town that went back and step by step footnoted all of his fraud. Interestingly enough, I think one of them said, I know one of them said, I read an article about it. She says, I'm not a Donald Trump supporter, but I'll tell you what, I'm not going to have somebody come in and lie about my community. I thought, Right on, lady. I think it was the woman. I'm doing this off the top of my head, Dan, on it, but it took an effort by that town to expose this guy. And it is a big deal right now in Germany because he won all the awards. He was a glitzy, glitzy top flight journalist. Well, he was a fraud. And it turns out that a lot of his prior articles and reports like that were littered with lies. Huh. Too bad, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But nobody does Schadenfreude like the Germans.
Yeah.
Right. Jim, one of the tidbits that we covered over the last year that I found really interesting was this fact that China's going into Venezuela and helping them create systems to see that they can tell who's loyal using electronic means like the internet and like that. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, that's a multi-pronged program. The one that's probably most relevant is their biometric identity card system. Now, this is not radical new technology, but the Chinese have implemented it widely in their own country, and it's something we used a lot during the war on terror, in Afghanistan and Iraq. You get those electronic thumbprints and the eye scans. The iris scans, nobody can hide anymore. And they basically distributed those cards nationwide, and you can't get food without those cards. So if you get tagged as a disloyal Venezuelan, no food for you. And often, for a growing number of people in Venezuela, that is the only source, the main source of food. Other than if you have any land where you can have a garden in the backyard, as it were, and that does get your attention because everybody, and of course they've set up they've expanded the nationwide informant. The loyal Venezuelan program. This is all right out of the Bolshevik playbook. It's nothing new, but they've just got better technology to work with. And of course, Venezuela is so broke that they can't afford the nationwide, video cam, coverage, which now China has linked to their facial recognition system. I mean, it's working. It's so good they even use it for verification for credit card payments. You just look at the camera and it gives you green or red. You're you or you're not, or that you're having a bad day in appearance wise. But it's very popular for those people who actually do not get mixed scores, as it were, on the facial recognition. Something else they don't talk about, but that's the reality of what actually happens. But they are making progress. But that's what happens when you have a police state. Venezuela, what the Chinese are trying to do is legally get claims on a lot of the state oil company assets, so that when there's a new government. And there will be a new government. It may not be, a new version of the current government, the Chavista party. But they want to basically be there as friends of Venezuela. Now, that's liable to be a long haul because a lot of Venezuelans are already grumbling about, what China is doing. I mean, that identity card thing, most Venezuelans know where that comes from and how it's being implemented, and they're not very happy. But they're starting, so you keep your mouth shut and get whatever food you can. But China is gearing up to deal with the lawyers, international and otherwise, so that when the smoke clears, even if a democratic government comes back into Venezuela, they own a chunk. They basically bought certain rights, debt diplomacy, as they call it, for China. But they're shrewd, they realize that they're not going to be able to rescue, the mess that the Chavista party has gotten the Venezuelan economy into. It's going to take a major political change to allow that to happen. But they are doing what they can. They are making a difference, but not enough. I mean, the corruption is so widespread. Basically, the problem is the government will look first at someone's loyalty rather than their competence for any job, and that includes most of the jobs in the state oil company. And unfortunately, those loyal people are often corrupt people. And so despite the Chinese efforts, the oil production continues to decline. More debts are coming due, including Chinese. They hold a lot of bad, Venezuelan paper, as they say on Wall Street. And this doesn't really bother the Chinese that much, because that just gives them more standing, when there's a reckoning after the total collapse. They're just basically one of the bigger debtors, holders of that paper, and that gives them standing in any legal proceedings. And they can then play the good cop again. Say, hey, come on, give the Venezuelans a break. We're willing to give up blah, blah, blah. Chinese are basically willing to give up a lot in order to establish a permanent presence, as it were, as a major minority owner of all those assets. Although Venezuela has low quality, very tar-like oil, they have the largest proven reserves in the world, over 300, billion barrels, trillion barrels.
No. Hey, Jim, it's 300 billion officially,
right.
But you see in some of the geological studies, it may be 400 billion, and that's if you had high-tech drilling and production capabilities. But, 300 billion, I think, is the official number.
The biggest problem the Venezuelans have is their oil is very expensive to refine. It requires a few additional steps to basically lighten it up, make it sweet, as they say.
It's got a ton of sulfur in it. That's one
exactly.
of them. Yeah.
A lot. They got a lot of bad stuff that's got to be gotten out of the oil, which normally doesn't come out of sweet crude, which you get a lot of in the United States. And unfortunately for the Venezuelans, most of the refineries that are geared to do that are in the United States. Oh, surprise, surprise. We were their biggest customer, and for a long time they thought they had us over the barrel, so to speak, but then along came fracking, everybody's friend. They basically have lost that card. They can't be too, how should I put it, mean economically towards the United States, because we're holding their key cards. It's a sad situation. And until adults get, put in charge of the government, or at least the economy, it's not going to get any better. Again, this gets misreported in the United States. They dance around what the real problems are. And, of course, they don't mention China, which is doing a very elegant end run. We don't regularly cover Venezuela anymore because peace has broken out completely in Colombia, which has always long been our main focus. A slow motion train wreck, which is what's going on in Venezuela, even for us, it doesn't make something you can cover. I mean, it's like logistics. You write military history, the last thing you want to cover is logistics, but that's the key element. So we got the same situation here with Venezuela. It's why, as an aside, quick aside, it's why many states and cities in the United States are close to bankruptcy, because the politicians realized a long time ago that you can borrow stuff like pensions. You can promise all sorts of pension forms, and you'll be dead and gone before this fraud you basically committed, ever comes due, it gets to the point where it can't be ignored. And that's why Detroit went bankrupt. And Chicago and the state of California and a few other large entities are approaching the moment of truth. But the people who began it and perpetrated it for decades, are either out of office or literally dead. And that's a weakness in modern politics. You can basically make long-range financial decisions, which can be hidden with rhetoric and basically, being nice to the press. And plus, most importantly, it's boring. Trying to explain it, is just not something. I was working full time down in Wall Street in 2008. Before that, since, and there were a lot of people down there who were aware of what was going on with these, these consolidated, debt obligations, and that they were fraudulent. I mean, it was even being reported in the media, but nobody was, and people who would come on the, on the tube and make the connections, people said, no, that can't be. Yeah, I mean, literally, the news managers I spoke to said that's incredulous. That's impossible. Who would do something as stupid as that? And I said, well, look, talk to the standard, talk to the rating agencies. I mean, I have people in the rating agencies complaining to me. There's money to be had, so everybody sort of bent the rules a little bit. And before you know that, the rules were doing a U-turn. And that's still a scandal, which has produced a lot of good books, which not enough people have read, because it's going to happen again. So it's not just in politics, it's not just in political finance, as it were, but also in national finance. Who's guarding the guards? And that's always a problem. That was a Roman saying originally, and they knew, and it hasn't changed.
Austin, it's time for us to wrap up. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think this has been one of the more interesting yearly reviews that we've done, because we have talked about some very dire potential wars. Korea could explode. China versus the United States. China versus India. Again, I don't seek a new Great Congo War, but Congo is unsettled. We didn't get into Iran and Yemen, but Iran is reeling economically, so we did get into it with some of the economic talk. But what Jim and I have been talking about, and here are two of them: information sources and reliability. That's come up, and also granularity of it. What if you want to know something about what's current on the Korean Peninsula? Read South Korean English language media. And I know from Koreans, hey, we write the same thing in English that we write in Korean. It's not like, as Jim points out, what you get with a lot of the Arabic press. No, it's the same stuff in both languages. You have to sometimes read between the lines. No, of course it's not perfect, but you get some insight into it over time. And of course, South Korea looks at North Korea very, very carefully because of the threat. And then Jim brought up the Spiegel story, and also distortion in mainstream media. No wonder it's hard for I say, look, most people, you've got too much to do. You rely on a summary to tell you, in some sort of summary, a summary news report, to give you vital information about, the American security or the American economy. And if it's distorted, biased politically, or you're not getting what you need. And here's the blatant example of the journalistic superstar in Germany who's a screaming fraud, and also missing the big stories often here in the U.S. So economy and information, we spent more time on that really than on military and diplomacy in some ways. I think that's what I want to say.
It's logistics again. And
there we are.
And one final thing. Google Translate is doing much better. There are many times there's a foreign language source, whether it be South Korean or even Chinese outside of China, where there is no English language version. And if you've been using Google Translate, even for East Asian languages, because they have different idioms and a different way of, how should I put it, presenting information, linguistically, you can make sense of it. And if you want to practice, take their English language, version, and go back to the original and put it through Google Translate, and you'll see what I mean. You can make sense of what they're talking about.
I haven't done that in a while. It's interesting that it's.
Well, I've been forced over the years, because it took a while for some of the more interesting South Korean media to have English language editions, and I've noticed. I mean, early on, the Google Translate was really crude. You had to really what do they mean there? It required a lot of background knowledge. But I've noticed recently, and when I'm going in and translating some technical topic, so to speak, from Korean or Japanese even, I can understand it. granted, I've been doing this for a long time, but they give a pretty. I'm looking for specific facts, and they are in there, and you can get them out. So, like I say, if you're dubious of them saying the same thing in English as they say in their native language, just run the original through Google Translate, and you'll see what I mean. You can verify. In other words, you don't have to just trust. You can verify.
Trust and verify. Look, South Korea, though, is an interesting place for. They do a lot of translation into English and Japanese, and now increasingly into Chinese. It's part of the fact that South Korea is something of a little cultural power with all the K-pop bands. The Korean pop, girl bands, and the like, they're very popular throughout Asia. All the way down to India. In other words, they're exporting rock and roll, television shows, and movies, and they're very. I can't say, of course, everything's automatically translated. It's not, but they do a lot of it, and a lot of their reporting articles. You get an English language version fairly quickly, if not the same day that it appears in Korean.
Yeah, on the top you'll see a bar in Japanese. It says Japanese version. In English it says English version.
Yeah.
And China says Chinese version. And then Austin's quite spot on. It's become quite standard in Korea because, as the North Koreans have learned to their regret, K-pop has basically conquered.
It's undermined their army.
Well, not only that, but the upper class, the 3% of the population that basically runs the place, their children are out of control. They openly have their hair cut in South Korean styles. Now they arrest the children of lesser mortals for doing that. But the princes and princesses, as they say, flaunt it, and they get away with it. That's an interesting change in South Korea.
Yep.
And North Korea.
Yeah, it is. But that's also when I say that South Korea has become something of a miniature cultural power. It's not really miniature when you look.
No, they're a major exporter of culture in East Asia. I mean, Japan had its moment and what have you. China hasn't had it yet. But the South Koreans, I mean, they haven't got any baggage like the Japanese did, and they're obviously closer to it, Japanese and Chinese culture, and bingo, they're spot on, and they're really cashing in on that. That's something you rarely hear.
Well, you remember that video that Psy made, about Gangnam Style. See,
yeah.
I've talked to Koreans about this. Some of this, the influence, long-term influence of having young American GIs hanging out in Seoul. All right.
Even more important.
But guess what?
All the South Korean soldiers served as Katyushas in the U.S. Army. That's where they got the sensibility because these guys spent a year. Living in the same barracks. I'll never forget that. We had the Katyushas living in our barracks. If you could speak good enough English when you graduated from high school and you got drafted, you could serve in the American Army, not the South Korean Army, which makes a big difference. Well, it did back 50 years ago. And these guys absorbed, for better or worse, American culture.
Well, someone would think it was worse. It's cultural.
I know. That's why I said that.
Right. I know you did, but the thing is that what these young South Koreans have decided, hey, if you can rock and roll in L.A., you can rock and roll in Seoul. So
exactly, right. They made it happen. Anyway,
well, our time is well spent. So
next year.
Yeah, we'll be talking to you both next year.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.